want to talk about something that the Lord's really helped me overcome. I'm 37 years old, something I've been struggling with that I've just recently overcome, and anxiety, or I guess it's more guilt and shame. And so at the beginning of the year, I was struggling with major financial hurdles. There's massive obstacles that I was trying to get through. And if I slept 2 hours straight at night, it would be a good night for probably 2.5 months. Somewhere I'd sleep for 45 minutes and wake up, and then I'd have to put a book on or some type of ambient noise on to try to knock me out. Just because the anxiety levels were so high, there was so much uncertainty, so much turmoil. I had issues in multiple businesses. I had issues financially that I had no idea how to deal with. And through all that, I experienced a tremendous amount of failure and loss. And I don't know if it was the way I was conditioned, or maybe this is common for everyone, but the way I was raised, that if you did something wrong, it automatically made you somehow subhuman. And I guess you can see some evidence of this in our cancel culture. But if you made a mistake, or if you failed in any way, then you were bad and you were less than. So for months, I mean, I've struggled with this concept of shame, and just completely beating up on myself every single day, and berating myself and replaying like the most useless thoughts. There's a YouTuber, Myron Golden, that talks about how when we have anxiety, it's unfounded fear on results that we can't affect. So I have these high levels of anxiety. I'm beating myself up day in and day out. And then I read the story of Peter in the Bible. And Peter's one of the disciples. He's the most fervent. He's the most outspoken. Yeah, he's the rah, egotistical one. And then when Christ is being crucified, when it's arguably the most important time for a follower of Jesus to stand up for what they believe in, Peter denies Christ not once but 3 times. And we're all familiar with that story. I mean, if you're a Christian, or if you're raised in the church, you're familiar with that story. But what jumped out at me for the first time ever, I never noticed it before, was what he had to have felt like after that. For all intents and purposes, Christ was crucified within eyesight, because it says he was sitting by the fire while they beat Christ. And the girl asked her, or the girl said, "Aren't you one of his followers?" And he said, "No." So he weeps, he disappears, and by our standards, he's a failure. He gave up on his Messiah. He turned his back on Christ when it mattered the most. And then he turns around. So then a couple chapters later, you have Peter preaching the sermon at Pentecost, which if you read it, it's in the book of Acts. It's a profound sermon, and it's not the sermon of someone who's operating out of a shame paradigm. It's somebody who's bold, who speaks loudly, who announces their faith in Christ, and 4,000 people are saved because of this. Where, by our standards, according to cancel culture, Peter should have buried his head in a hole, and he should have been self-flagellating himself for how he failed as a follower of Christ. And it's just wild, because Peter was not operating out of this paradigm of guilt and shame, because he was operating out of the freeness and the forgiveness and love of Jesus Christ. 4,000 people in that one event are saved. And then Peter goes on to be one of the most influential apostles in the Bible. And I was reading this story. I was actually at a seminar at the beginning of the year. It was in May. And I'm reading this in the balcony of the hotel. And a guy came up to me and started talking to me, and he said, "Hey, what are you reading? What are you learning about?" And I started telling him. It was a complete stranger, but I started explaining to him, just being very vulnerable with this guy. And he pointed out to me, he's like, "Yeah, I've actually noticed that. I've underwent some failure. I had a company that went bankrupt last year." And he's like, "If you'll notice, when Mary realizes that Jesus has risen, he tells the angels say to Mary, 'Go tell the disciples and Peter,'" meaning this is 3 days later. This is the day that they discovered that Christ had risen. So 3 days later, Peter didn't even consider himself an apostle anymore, or a disciple, because it says, "Go tell the disciples and Peter." And just the forgiveness that Christ extended to him, and then the ministry that he was able to go on and lead, simply because he didn't crawl into a hole and die, or hang his head in shame, or disappear into the ether. He essentially refused to cancel himself. And it's just crazy how much of our lives, and maybe this is not everyone, but I look back on how much of my life was operated out of a fear paradigm because of failures, where if we ignore that and we're operating out of love and we're operating out of forgiveness for ourselves, especially, a lot of times we don't need to forgive other people. We need to forgive ourselves. How we can go on to do powerful, effective things in the world, and how we can actually transform the people around us. But no one living in shame is transforming anybody.